Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Davis Carey, and I'm Executive Director of the Worcester Education Collaborative. Thank you all for joining us. This is the third of a three-part series that we are hosting on assessment. And it is a joint program of Worcester Education Collaborative and the Worcester Education Equity Roundtable. In our first gathering, we talked about the background of the MCAS. We looked at Worcester's results and talked about, in the other meeting that we had, talked about the State Board of Education's decision to increase the test scores and some of the thinking that went behind that and what some of the impact would be of that. Today, we are going to talk about widening the concept of assessment and the idea of both alternative and complementary assessments that look at things beyond just kids' straight academic performance in a targeted set of subject areas. What are some of the other metrics that we might consider? How does that enhance, how can that be used to enhance the quality of education and enhance the quality of the experience for students, parents, teachers, and administrators? One of the things that's important to note is this is a concept that seems to be getting some wind in its sails. DESE has some initiatives related to performance tasks, particularly in the grade 5 and 8 science. And also some other initiatives in some of our districts that are driven by district interest and parent and school committee interest. So that said, let's get on with it. Let me introduce our featured speaker for today, Jack Schneider. Jack has been in Worcester actually in 3D just before the pandemic, not just virtually, and did a presentation for us on some of the work that he is doing. Jack is a professor of education at UMass Lowell and is also the director of the Education Commonwealth Project. He's been very involved in this concept of alternative assessments and is working very closely in Somerville, Massachusetts, on some of the work that he has been engaged in. Jack is a resident of Somerville, and his daughter is a student there in the public schools, and he is also a former teacher, so he knows from which he speaks. Our facilitator today will be Noe Medina. Noe, would you like to say a few words as we get started?
Hi, folks. Excited to be here to listen to the conversations that go on here. I'm a consultant working with WEC and facilitating the Worcester Roundtable. I've had the pleasure of doing that for the last few months. So welcome everyone who's here. I'm sure we're going to be getting a really interesting presentation and then conversation.
Great. Emily, did I miss anything?
No, Jen, that's great. Thanks, everyone. So I think at this point, we are ready to turn things over to Jack. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Jack.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. And thanks to all of the boxes that I can't see for being boxes on this screen right now. Hopefully we can all see each other, as Jen said, in 3D. So as I was talking with Noe and others about how to make this maximally useful for you all, I think what we agreed was that rather than just talk at you the entire time, that I would frame my remarks around getting a conversation started so that you all know what I'm ready to talk about. And if any of that squares with the things that you're really interested in, then we'll actually be able to have a conversation that's aligned with your needs, your concerns, your interests. What I'll do is provide some background information here about why we do the work we do through the Education Commonwealth Project, which is a sister organization of the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment, MCIEA. You can go to mciea.org, or you can go to edcommonwealth.org at any point to learn more about this. I'll give you a little background, and then I'll talk you through what we're doing through ECP, as we call it, that could potentially be of service to families, community members, educators, school leaders, anywhere in the Commonwealth. It could, of course, be of use to anyone, anywhere, but I'll talk through why it's particularly designed for folks here in Massachusetts. So I'm going to share my screen right now. And as I joked with Noe, I'm going to do 88 slides in 19 minutes. So hope you can read fast here. All right. So what's possible? Let's dive in. You all probably know all of this already, but just so that we all get on the same page, let's talk a little bit about what's wrong with the way that we currently assess school quality and student learning. So let's start with students, right? We know from research, as well as from our experience, those of us who are in classrooms and in districts, that there are major impacts on what students are taught, as well as how they're taught. And then here in Massachusetts, as well as in 7 other states, there are impacts on whether or not students actually walk away with a diploma. So what I mean about the first point is, I think, really nicely exemplified in this chart from the Center on Education Policy that shows how much time gets devoted to testing. And this doesn't even begin to capture the story with regard to things like the narrowing of the curriculum. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what slide am I going to use here in terms of demonstrating the impact on students. But we could show the number of minutes of recess as they have declined over the years for students. We could show the number of minutes that students get in terms of arts instruction or music instruction. We could even talk about the number of minutes that they get in untested core subject areas like history. All have declined under test-based accountability. And then, of course, there are impacts on things like the feel of a classroom, right? What teachers are incentivized to do that often runs counter to what they know about good instruction. And then on top of that, here in Massachusetts, as well as in 7 other states, we have an exit exam. We don't call it that. We call it an MCAS requirement. But if you don't pass 10th grade MCAS, you don't get a diploma. Now, I'm oversimplifying. There is another route to acquiring a diploma, but I do think it's important to underscore that this is a part of an assessment and accountability system that has very serious consequences for young people. And particularly, as this slide illustrates, right, I'm just quoting from research here, particularly for racially minoritized students and economically marginalized students. Okay, it's not just students who are impacted by the present assessment and accountability regime. It's also schools. So we can talk first about the blame and shame approach here, which is baked into the theory of change behind test-based accountability, right? Test-based accountability operates under the assumption, now I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but not much, under the assumption that educators are hiding their best lesson plans in their desks. And what they need is to have a fire lit under them. And maybe then they'll actually start doing the work that we want them to do. We know that's wrong, right? We know that that is a flawed theory of change, and that trying to heap blame on schools is deeply problematic. We also know that schools improve when they have support, right? That this theory of change that posits that what schools need is more pressure is deeply flawed. So what do I mean about blame and shame, right? That schools, for the most part, are actually not responsible for opportunity gaps that plague our society. So this comes, the bottom piece here comes from research done by folks across a number of institutions, including Stanford, where I did my graduate degree, that tried to distill what is the influence of in-school versus out-of-school factors on student standardized test scores. Now compare that to a headline that I grabbed from the Globe about how we ostensibly know what the best and worst school districts are simply by virtue of looking at their MCAS scores, right? So the present regime as it operates channels our attention on schools and districts as the sole cause of opportunity gaps that we know, for the most part, happen outside of school. And unless we change the way that we are assessing schools, as well as complicate how we're thinking about student learning, right, we're going to be stuck in a place where we continue to try to identify schools that are ineffective. And really what we're going to be doing is just pointing the finger at communities serving racially minoritized students, economically marginalized students, linguistically minoritized students, students with disabilities, right? That doesn't help. Second, if we're talking about how schools improve with support. They don't improve with pressure. And I just grabbed a study about principals' working conditions, but this applies to educators as well. Everybody who is on this call who works in schools or districts knows that pressure only makes the job harder. It only makes conditions more challenging. It does not lead to the kind of capacity building that actually promotes improvement. I pulled a little piece here about the implications from this one particular study, right? That sanction-based accountability pressure appears to make the principalship more stressful and lead to turnover. And we all know that turnover is the secret to school improvement. No, I'm being glib, right? That is an unintended but not unforeseeable consequence. We've talked about students and schools. Let's just talk about communities, since they often get overlooked here, right? There's often a lot of token recognition of what is good for communities or what communities want for themselves. But the reality is that the current accountability system, designed primarily around student standardized test scores, often results in stripping communities of control and has this deeply problematic but not unforeseeable consequence of exacerbating segregation. So with regard to loss of control, I just want to point to one study that found that schools serving predominantly Black students have been closed at rates that are far higher than schools serving predominantly white student bodies, right? That if what we are talking about is empowering communities, then a system that is designed around pressure, threats, blame, punishment does not actually empower communities. In this case, it actually disempowers communities that have been systemically disempowered for all of this nation's history. With regard to segregation, now this comes from greatschools.org, which uses, of course, state data and then embeds it in real estate websites. So what you see on the left here is a screen grab that I took. I live in Somerville, as was referenced earlier, a screen grab that I took of, I think this is from Trulia. Many of these real estate websites embed greatschools.org into their search functions. And so I searched for the neighborhood where I live, and I said, show me all schools with the lowest possible ranking or higher, right? So just show me all schools. And you can see the black apples there, I don't know why they chose that color scheme, represent all of the nearby schools. And those were the homes that were for sale. Obviously, this is a bit dated because Somerville has gentrified so rapidly that I would recommend snatching up all these properties if these were actually the prices that these things were going for. But then on the right side of the screen, you'll see I set the bar to 10. Show me only 10 rated schools, right? The top of the scale, all the schools disappear. Now, if this were a longer presentation, I would walk you through a backing out on the map so we can see where all of the highly rated schools are, right? They don't tend to be in diverse areas or areas that have large concentrations of Black students, brown students, poor students, students with disabilities, students speaking other languages, right? And that steers people towards particular kinds of neighborhoods because the message that's being sent is there are no good schools here. Well, of course, the current system is not actually measuring schools. In this case, it's measuring demographic data in disguise. And when it's steering you, it is racially steering you. It is steering you in terms of social class. It's steering you in terms of people's immigration status or language status. And that is deeply problematic. Okay, so we've talked about what's wrong in terms of impacts on students, schools, and communities, but let's not forget that the data that we end up with often isn't particularly usable, right? So what are we supposed to learn when we see that our district is mostly partially meeting expectations? And of course, these data are outdated by definition by the time that we get them, right? Or they can be presented like this, right? Maybe we live in a district that happens to be doing exceptionally well according to DESI's system, which, by the way, is more or less the same as the system we see in all 50 states, right? So add to all of those unintended consequences the fact that the data that we end up with is often not particularly useful for the purpose of school and district improvement. So if we want to do better, I think we have some lessons that we can learn from all of this. First is that we need to support the full mission of public education, right? Schools are not test prep factories, or at least they shouldn't be. Schools are places where young people learn what they're good at, what they're interested in. They explore their talents and abilities. They get exposed to a broad and varied curriculum. They hopefully go to school with a lot of kids who aren't exactly like them, right? Hopefully they have a chance to play and to be creative. Schools do a lot of things, and any assessment system that is purporting to measure student learning and school quality needs to recognize that. Second, we need to allow all students to show what they know and can do. So one part of the problem, if we're looking at gaps in test scores across racial groups, language groups, across social class. One problem is that we have terrible opportunity gaps in this country. But another problem is that standardized tests aren't a particularly good way of allowing students to show you what they know, right? And so if we want to increase the ability of our assessment system to tell us what students know and can do, we need to move beyond standardized tests. Third, we need to better distinguish between in-school and out-of-school effects, right? That if we want to know how schools are doing, if we want to know how students are progressing academically, then we can't simply rely on assessment technologies that are telling us more about out-of-school effects than about in-school effects. Fourth, we need to build capacity, right? An assessment system that is built into an accountability system needs to be oriented around the idea of building school and district capacity, of increasing the ability of educators and leaders to do the jobs that they already know how to do, rather than punching down against educators and school leaders who are working, in many cases, with vulnerable populations, with marginalized populations, and who require additional support and resources to meet the needs of the populations they're working with. Fifth, we need to take seriously the mandate of empowering communities, right? There has been a lot of performative talk about empowering communities through assessment and accountability. I haven't seen a lot in terms of action that truly empowers them. So if we're talking about assessment here, we need to be thinking about how are assessment results, whether about student learning or school quality, going to allow community members to become more engaged, to learn more about what's going on, to become involved. I don't mean to be shoppers, right, who are navigating quote unquote choices. I mean to become involved members of an educational community. Sixth, right, advancing racial and economic equity needs to be at the core of what we're talking about, and it can't merely be talk, right? We need to be thinking about every element of this system and how it impacts the aim of racial and economic equity. So segregation is a good example there, right? We need to be thinking ahead in terms of what is this system going to do to actually bring people together and increase opportunities for minoritized and marginalized groups rather than segregating and limiting opportunities. And then finally, we need to offer actionable information to educators and to school leaders who are smart enough, who are talented enough, who usually don't have enough time, right? So that's something else we need to provide them, right? But to provide them with better data so that their data walls don't just look like, enlarged MCAS score reports. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about what we're up to with the Education Commonwealth Project. So ECP grew out of the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment. It's an 8-district consortium. Attleboro, Boston, Lowell, Milford, Revere, Somerville, Wareham, and Winchester, I think I got them all in alphabetical order there, are our 8-member districts. MCIEA is a laboratory where we are trying out new ways of assessing student learning and school quality, and ECP is the dissemination arm of MCIEA, where our goal is to provide free and open source tools and practices to anyone, anywhere. And if you happen to live in Massachusetts, we have funding from the state legislature to work directly with schools, public schools, and public districts to provide support for using these tools. We focus our work chiefly in 2 areas, what we call school quality measures and performance assessments. So this is how we are thinking about assessing school quality and how we are thinking about assessing student learning in ways that are more democratic, more valid in that we're measuring what we purport to measure, and more equitable. So this first question, how should we assess our schools, right? I'm just showing you a screenshot of the MCIEA/ECP data dashboard, which right away is signaling a variety of things, right? That school quality is not something that can be distilled to a number or a letter grade, that school performance is not something that can be aggregated into a single category. We have 5 categories around which we organize our school quality information. And then each is made up of multiple subcategories, which in turn is made up of multiple measures. So one of the things that is baked into this approach is a different kind of theory of change, right? So I alluded earlier to a theory of change that posits that what people need is threats and pressure. Our belief in this project is that actually, that's not what people need. What people need is information and support. And so one of the ways that we try to drive that forward is by presenting information in a way that emphasizes quality improvement as a process, right? Any of us who have worked in the context of schools, working towards school and district improvement, know it doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't happen with name calling, right? But it does happen when you have clear and specific information that you can track over time and that shows you how far from your targets you are, right? We don't give schools A through F grades. We don't give them 1 through 100 ratings, right? What we try to do is show how far are you from reaching your benchmark? And then we're taking that a step further these days and trying to identify what are the kinds of supports that might help get you the rest of the way there. In doing this, in offering this broader range of school performance, one of the things that we do is draw on multiple measures. So you can see here that we pull from school administrative data. We have a student survey that is free and open source for you. So if you walk away from this and you say, that data dashboard seems awfully complicated. He talked a lot of nonsense about things I'm not interested in, but boy, we could sure use a student survey. We're happy to give that to you. It's free and open source, as is the teacher survey that we use. And we take the scales from our student survey and our teacher survey and combine the results of those along with school administrative data to try to provide a multifaceted picture of how schools are doing across the full range of the mission of public education. I included on the right just a table from a research project of ours. If you want to look at the whole paper, you can search for it. It was in the open source journal, AERA Open. Just search my name at AERA Open. But what we're showing there is just that one of the things that we try to do is test everything to make sure that we aren't simply presenting demographic data in disguise. So we tested our survey data and found that there was a very weak correlation, right? Almost no correlation at all with race and socioeconomic status as measured by the state, because we were relying on their data, as opposed to, if you look just below that, achievement percentile or absenteeism percentile, right? Those are two of the cores of the present accountability system, not just here in Massachusetts, but across most states. You see very strong correlation. Well, I shouldn't say very strong in case there are psychometricians in the audience. Moderate to strong correlations, right? But for a layperson, I would say these are pretty strong correlations here, strong and negative, indicating that they're telling you a lot about schools merely by identifying who the population is. And I have serious questions, as do most scholars, about whether or not that's really telling you about schools. And then ultimately, what we're working on is a system that is built on the idea of reciprocal accountability. Again, this is related to this different theory of change, right? That is not about markets and pressure and threats and punishment, but which is really about support, information, and understanding that improvement is a process. So this actually comes from work in Lowell that we've been doing. Lowell is a member of MCIEA and also happens to be in my backyard since I teach at UMass Lowell. And one of the things we're doing is trying to align district supports with the areas as identified by our SQM process, areas identified as growth areas. So if a school needs to grow in a particular area and educators and school leaders believe that that's where they want to focus their energies, then trying to identify, well, what are the existing district supports that align with that so that we can systematize this a bit? Moving away from assessing school quality and into assessing student learning, our focus through MCIEA and ECP is on performance assessments. So we have developed 6 qualities of a performance assessment that it aligns to learning targets and 21st century skills, that it's open-ended, unlike most MCAS questions, and relevant to the real world, again, unlike most MCAS questions, that it requires application and transfer of learning, right? That it goes beyond merely regurgitating facts, that it's fair and culturally responsive, that it outlines clear criteria for success. And that's important because it not only allows students to work towards success, but also then, if they haven't succeeded, to figure out, well, how can I take this information and use it? Or rather allows educators to say, okay, where are students succeeding and where are they not? I've got highly actionable information here in order to get them to success on this task. And then finally results in original products or solutions, which as educators know, feel more real and valuable to young people learning in the classroom. Just a couple of examples about how performance assessments allow students to show what they know. So here are a couple of performance assessments that are in our performance assessment task bank. Again, all of our ECP work is free and open source. So no matter where you are joining this call from, you can access the task bank and get tasks like this that can be used in the appropriate grade levels in the appropriate subject areas as they are organized. But if you live in Massachusetts, then we can offer additional trainings that go with that. And beyond allowing students to show what they know, performance assessment tasks also allow students to show what they can do, right? So performance tasks can and should be process oriented as much as they are outcome oriented. So I said that we needed to do 7 things in order to do assessment better. And those are the things that we are trying to do through the Education Commonwealth Project, right? That we're trying to support the full mission of public education. And that's not just at the level of the school, it also is inside the classroom so that students are learning a full and varied curriculum and have plenty of opportunities to show what they know, to show what they can do, regardless of whatever their background is. That we're trying to distinguish between in-school and out-of-school factors, and we're testing our data constantly for that. We're orienting our data around the idea of capacity building, as well as thinking through what are the kinds of systemic supports that would actually lead to school and district improvement, and not just for the purpose of empowering school leaders, but also for the purpose of empowering community members, right? Again, not as shoppers, but rather as engaged members of the community so that they can know what's happening in schools, so they can be partners, so they can be allies, so they can ask questions, so they can do more to support their own kids at home, and so that community members who don't have children at home can also become involved in the life of a school or a district. we're always working to advance racial and economic equity in our work. And we're also trying to make the work of educators easier, or at least more effective, even if it isn't easier, by offering them actionable information. So just a reminder that all our stuff is free and open source. If you go to edcommonwealth.org, you'll be able to eventually find this page that describes who can use the resources and why you should become a partner. But the thing that I want to continue emphasizing here is free and open. It's a big part of our philosophy. We don't believe that educators and leaders at the school and district level should be paying consultants for the kinds of supports that are absolutely necessary for everyone everywhere. These should be the rights of not just educators and school leaders, but of young people in schools to know that everybody outside the school who works in education is actually invested in the success of schools and districts, and not because their own bottom lines are involved. If you want to stay in touch, that's my email address. You actually can't get it online these days because I tend to write pretty frequently for the public, and occasionally I will kick the hornet's nest and end up on Fox News. But that's my email address. If you all want to get in touch with me, I've also put Julie Spencer Robinson's email address there. She's the Director of Engagement for the Education Commonwealth Project, and is just about the most organized and responsive person I've ever met. So if you email both of us, I'm pretty good, but you'll definitely get a quicker response from Julie. Our website and our, I think, kind of brand new Twitter handle are listed there as well. So, I guess follow us. Since we're new, I doubt we have any followers. Be our first followers. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. I think you all now have a sense of, what we're up to through this project. And I think I'm now done sharing. There we go. And we can enter into a conversation. I know that I'm going to talk with Noe, and then you all are going to have a chance to also ask the kinds of questions that you want to ask and make the comments you want to make.
Jack, thank you for that. That was a great conversation and impressive use of a whole lot of slides, as you promised. So we're going to take about 15 minutes for Jack and I to talk a little bit. I pose a couple of questions to him, and then I'm going to take some of the questions from the chat and invite people who are asking them to ask them themselves rather than ask it for them, unless they've left, in which case I will ask it for them. So one thing I was wondering about, Jack, in terms of the performance assessments that you're developing, sort of how are they being developed, and how are they being used as part of your school quality framework? Yeah,
that's a really good question. So a big multi-billion-dollar for-profit corporation develops them and then owns the IP. Nope, actually, just kidding. They are teacher-created, classroom embedded, standards aligned, and then free and open for anyone, anywhere. And we provide training for educators who want to learn how to develop performance assessments. And like any good politician, I'll answer the question that I wish you had asked. Although, like a bad politician, I think I answered the question that was actually asked. I'm supposed to just dodge that, but I'm not a politician. So, the other thing that I want to mention there is that the performance assessments, it could just be nice PD, right? I remember being an educator and thinking like, I wanted to get my hands on like good materials. I wanted to get involved in good PD, but we've also been trying to think of the use of performance assessments as a kind of system. And right now where we're at is that in light of the fact that we think that the 10th grade MCAS requirement and de facto exit exam for a high school diploma is inequitable, we have research evidence that it is inequitable, we're thinking about, can we build a system such that schools and districts would be able to use performance assessments as an alternative to 10th grade MCAS, since they are going to tell us a lot more about what students know and can do. And then to return to your question, Noe, they're not just created by a single teacher and used in a single classroom, right? That there's a process for developing them that actually allows educators to offer each other feedback on those tasks. And then the process of rating can include multiple raters there rating student work. Now, I don't want to draw necessarily a parallel between the Education Commonwealth Project and the College Board, but anybody who's participated like in the AP Summer Institute, who I've ever talked to, has found that there's a lot of value there in terms of thinking through rating what are eventually what are at their core some performance assessments in terms of things like history DBQs. So we're thinking a lot about how we can not just empower educators to create these and give them away, but do so in a way that makes them really a viable alternative to standardized tests.
And specifically to the MCAS.
Specifically, yes.
Or at least to the current iteration of the
Right.
MCAS.
Yep.
And are the results of the performance assessments incorporated into the framework that you've created, the school quality framework?
Yeah, they certainly can be. So if you don't have performance assessments, then there are other ways of trying to build in information about what students know and can do. But ideally, in the ideal system, right, you are systemically using performance assessments to better understand student learning and then building that into the school quality measures framework to help everybody in the school, the district, understand what do students in our school or in our district know? What can they do? And where are the gaps so that we can meet that with programming, and to do so on a much more frequently updating basis than MCAS, right? That potentially you could have performance assessments refreshing every quarter, every semester, or educators could be using them in their classroom and getting instant feedback in a way that MCAS doesn't currently provide.
Mm-hmm. What sort of feedback have you gotten from the districts you're working with on the performance assessments that you're using now? What kind of, in terms of how practical they are, what teachers are saying about them? Yeah,
I think educators generally like them. Hard to say anything about a large group of people, but what I hear is primarily positive. What I hear in terms of the training educators have received is primarily positive. They appreciate being treated like professionals who have skills, who know a heck of a lot about how students learn, who know a ton about curriculum, and who know a lot about their own students and their own curriculum, such that they're able to develop tasks that really meet their local needs. I think the challenge with performance assessments is that right now we have an assessment accountability system that continues to point everybody's focus in the direction of standardized test scores. And so the challenge is, how do you build an alternative system alongside an existing system that has high stakes associated with it? And so one of the things we've been forced to wrestle with is, what is in it for schools and districts when there already is an accountability regime in place, right? They're already being told you are not free from the existing system. So what's in it for them other than just doing right by young people and doing right by themselves as professionals? And I don't say that glibly, because they don't have any, nobody's providing extra time, right? Nobody's saying like, hey, overworked principal, we're gonna give you a second principal to help distribute the work. Hey, superintendent of a small district who wears 19 different hats, right? Guess what we just found? An extra $1 million for you. Nobody's saying to educators, you know what? We're not going to make you supervise lunch or go out on the playground, and you're only going to teach 3 classes a day because we actually want you to be building a new kind of assessment system. So there are some challenges there, right? But what we've been doing is trying to think through, how can we make this as light a lift as possible, including creating the easiest possible on-ramp for people to begin experimenting with this work so that they can decide, so that they can drive this at whatever speed they want.
So part of what you're saying is there has to be some mind shift change in the schools and the communities as well to begin to embrace the kind of approach you're talking about in terms of performance assessment.
Yeah, I think so. And not just performance assessment, but also school quality measures, right? Because I think one of the things that has happened over the past 20 years is that we have all acclimated even those of us who resist the testing and accountability regime have become acclimated to it in many ways. And in many cases, it's because we have to be, right? That we don't all have the ability to say, I'm not going to do this. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is give people the opportunity to kind of build their own adventure, to build your own on-ramp, because our real goal here is not to create a one-size-fits-all tool that everybody will adopt, but rather to meet people where they are and to try to build a movement such that, whether it's 6 months from now or 6 years from now, that advocates of fairer, more just, more equitable assessment can point around and say, this is what we want to do instead, something like what these districts are doing. And so that, I think Julie will laugh when I say this, because she's often heard me say, we don't want to let 1,000 flowers, that's a lot of flowers, 1,000 flowers, but like, 10, 15, right? If we saw districts were using some of our tools in ways we hadn't anticipated, that would be amazing, right? Because we don't have all the answers. I think what we have right now are some pretty powerful tools and practices that we're just trying to give away. And then the next step is like, you use them, you tell us what they're good for, you push them as far as you can, and then let us learn from you and teach other schools and other districts. That's how movements grow. And so we really think of our work as being more like movement building than like sort of top-down governance.
One of the things that supporters of the MCAS point to is as a benefit is that it's been able to highlight the inequities in the system in a way that other regimes hadn't before. How do you see your framework being able to do that and potentially do it better?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the first thing that I would point to is the fact that the current approach, which again is not just in Massachusetts, it's across all 50 states, right, pretends as if the only inequities that exist in schools are in student standardized test scores, attendance rates, and graduation rates, right? I can tell you for a fact that most privileged people in Massachusetts want a hell of a lot more from their schools and get those things in their schools, right? And so what I want for young people in Massachusetts is all of that stuff for every kid. That's why I think it's so essential to track every element of school quality, right? My daughter goes to a school where she gets something like 12 minutes to eat her lunch, right? She gets art and music 1 day a week. I can tell you that there are private schools that give kids art and music every day, right? There are public schools that give their kids long enough to eat lunch. There are schools everywhere who are meeting the needs and demands of the most advantaged. And I'm not so much concerned with those schools or those families. What I want is for every young person, regardless of their background, to get the kind of education that the most privileged students and their families are insistent upon and demand. And you're not going to get there if all you're looking at is student standardized test scores. And then I think the other key piece here is that we have to pay attention to the fact that present measurement and accountability systems are telling us a whole lot more about out-of-school variables than in-school variables. And so if what we care about is strengthening educational opportunities for young people, we have to figure out, well, where are there disparities in their educational opportunities? And present systems really aren't aligned with that. And that's not to say I don't care about out-of-school disparities. I care tremendously about those, but we should be more careful in the way that we are trying to assess where these disparities in our society are. There are tremendous opportunity gaps outside of schools. I just happen to believe that they're not as large inside schools as they are outside schools. And when we really muddy this conversation and pretend that inequity lies, the flaws in our society lie at the doorstep of our public schools, I think that that is actually deeply unhelpful and unproductive. I think it leads to school bashing, reform churn. I think it leads to more burnout among leaders and educators. And so in short, Noe, the second part of my answer here, in addition to the first part, which is I want everything for the least advantaged that the most advantaged get for their own kids, is that what I want to see is a system that actually parses out where the gaps in opportunity inside and outside schools are for young people, and that focuses on building capacity and on closing those gaps, rather than, again, on what I've referred to as a flawed theory of change that posits that this is somehow schools' fault, educators are perhaps to blame, let's ratchet the pressure up, and that's magically going to solve the problem.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to some of the questions we've gotten in the chat. It's terrific questions, and I'm just going to call on folks. If no one responds, then I'll ask the question. So, just unmute yourself and ask the question. Let me see here. Jane Heaney from the Worcester Schools had a question on multilingual learners.
Hi, thanks. Actually, somebody responded to it privately to me. I was asking, how does ECP accommodate the needs of multilingual learners?
Well, if you got your answer, I hope that my answer is going to be aligned with it. We have been working with MABE in order to try to think through exactly this question. So, as somebody who's asking a question about multilingual learners, emerging bilinguals, I'm sure you're well aware of the outrageous fact that emerging bilingual students can't, for instance, take the math part of the MCAS in the language that they are most fluent in,
Yes.
Which then ultimately tells us very little about what they can do in math, right? And so thinking through, how can we, in this case, it would be through the use of performance assessments, how can we create performance assessments that are aligned with standards that will tell us what students know and can do, but that will give them access to the challenge there?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Mara, is it Mara Safer or Mara Safer? Soffer?
Mara, yes.
Mara? Okay, thanks, Mara.
So my question in the chat, and I have so many questions, but my question in the chat was as much to WEC probably as to you about, we have so many organizations in the Commonwealth and across the country working to reimagine education. And I'm without the buy-in of school boards and school committees, I'm just wondering where this is leading and how these changes are going to take place.
I'm happy to jump in on that one and say, like, we have that same question, which is why one of the things that we do whenever a school or district contacts us is say, right away, let's start the conversation with your school committee, with your teachers union, with district central office, if they're not the ones who reached out to us, right? Because schools and districts have multiple stakeholders, have multiple power centers, and that if anything's going to succeed, everybody needs to be on the same page, that it's not a successful approach to say, well, we're going to work with these particular stakeholders in this community, and hopefully everybody else comes along for the ride.
Thank you.
Mary Tamer. You had a question about use of the.
Oh, I know. It wasn't so much about the use, actually, not a question, but a statement that, that one of the things we're seeing is just some really concerning rates of literacy among our third graders in Massachusetts. And so it's essentially 51% of third graders are reading proficiently in Massachusetts right now. And then if you look at cities like Boston, it's closer to 30%. And so this is one of the things that standardized assessments are, I believe, why they're needed, especially as a tool for equity, because when you look across student groups, those numbers are even lower. If you look at students of color, low-income students, students with disabilities, and English learners. And so I think I was just making the point that that's something that a performance-based assessment won't tell you, which doesn't mean that performance-based assessments don't give you good information. They just don't give you the same standardized information that we get from MCAS.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And first I'll counter and then I'll agree with you. The counter is that there's no reason why a performance assessment couldn't be standardized. I gave the example of the AP exam earlier, and there's an example if you look at any of the AP tests that do have performance assessments built into them. So the DBQ section on the AP US history test, those are essentially performance assessments. They're standardized, so they do allow you to do that. But let me agree with you for a minute and make a point that I haven't made, and which is really important, and that is standardized tests would be really a whole lot less harmful if they didn't have high stakes associated with them, right? And standardized tests would be a whole lot less disruptive if we didn't test every student in every grade, grades 3 through 8, as well as in 10th grade, every year. Right? So there are things that we could do where we could actually keep standardized assessments and then de-weaponize them and actually make them less disruptive. So just look at what we do through the National Assessment of Educational Progress, right? The so-called Nations Report Card, NAEP, which long predates state standardized tests and which actually produces better and more usable data in many cases while actually testing students far less. And a part of the better data, right, comes from the fact that it has no stakes associated with it. So people aren't gaming the NAEP. They aren't distorting the curriculum in order to raise their NAEP scores. So while I will push back against the idea that you couldn't have a standardized performance assessment, I do agree with you that, you know, we ought to think about how could we make standardized tests less dangerous, less problematic, right? And there are certainly ways to do it. In fact, one of them, which I just named, is done by the federal government, the same government that requires all states to have high stakes tests.
Presumably also having a standardized test as part of a system of assessment as opposed to the sole tool would change its context.
That's a great add-on, Noah. You're absolutely right, because if you have multiple measures, right, that's going to give you not only a more accurate picture of how students are learning and how schools are doing, but it's also, again, going to remove these built-in incentives to game a kind of singular measure.
Just a quick follow-up, Jack. So are you saying you would support MCAS if the graduation requirement was, when you're talking about the whatever harmful mechanism you're referring to, is it the graduation requirement specifically or something?
I'm talking about all of the stakes that are associated with MCAS, grades 3 through 8, as well as 10.
Got it.
I'm gonna ask a question on behalf of Marco Andrade from the school district, because he's not in a position to ask it. So he asks, have you lobbied DESE and the state board about these ideas? And if so, what's their response been? Do you have they indicated there's any flexibility on their part around the accountability system?
I'm going to have to be diplomatic here, which is not my strong suit. So first, I will say that we have strong support in the state legislature. Let me also say that we have support from organizations like MASS, from AFT Mass, from the MTA, from Citizens for Public Schools, and that there are folks inside the department as well as on the state board, who I think are very amenable to these ideas. Here comes the diplomatic part. I believe that we're all in different places on this journey, and that it's all of our duty to help those who currently don't see the light to come around on how we assess what students know and can do, and how we assess how our schools are doing. Because I honestly do believe that everybody who works at DESE is trying to help young people. I have sometimes said very impolitic things in order to try to spur people to action. And sometimes those things can imply that, for instance, there are people who work at DESE, perhaps in support of the measurement accountability system, who don't care about kids. And that's simply not true. I think everybody who works at the department, everybody who's on the board, everybody who works in schools, everybody who works adjacent to schools wants young people to succeed. And so the challenge then is, how can we try to create something of a consensus vision that different people can buy into? And I think a part of getting there is our approach of saying, hey, we don't need to throw the old system out entirely immediately, because I don't think that a lot of people are ready for that. I know a lot of people like me are ready for that. But I think if we start framing this as, well, what if there were new flexibilities? What if some schools, some districts were able to go this far or this far, and then show you what they're able to accomplish, right? Can we talk about that? I think that ultimately is a more pragmatic approach that's going to be more successful, given the fact that there are champions of MCAS who firmly believe that the reason we are quote unquote number one, and we're not, if you look at things like opportunity gaps, right, and equity gaps, who believe that MCAS is the reason for that. And rather than debate that point or call each other names, I think let's all agree we all want the same thing, and then let's try to create more opportunities for experimentation, and then let the evidence lead us collectively towards what actually works for young people.
And do you have any sense that they're leaders on the board or in DESE who are open to that suggestion of at least beginning to move in that direction?
I think so, but I think they'll be even more open to it if they feel pressure from political leaders, constituents, high-profile superintendents and educators. There are groups that understand how politics works and who are right now applying that exact kind of pressure. But in addition to showing that there is a lot of demand and that people are angry, I think it's also important to do that thing I mentioned a moment ago that, I think I sometimes forget to do, which is recognize ultimately we all are on the same team, right? That there are no like true villains working in or adjacent to schools. And I think if we remember that, I know if I remember that, that makes it easier for me to try to frame what I'm proposing in a manner that respects the ideas that somebody else has, and to remember that I don't have any kind of singular claim on the truth. And in fact, probably the best system ultimately that we may get to 5 years from now, 10 years from now, is going to be a hybrid of a lot of different visions. And so our goal in this work is to try to foster growth in a direction that we really haven't seen yet. And I'm sure that there will be other projects that try to tug us a little bit in another direction. And ultimately, I think that kind of experimentation and tugging in different directions is how we will eventually arrive at a system that really works.
Yeah, so that was Jack putting his politics hat on that he said he didn't have before. Thank you, Jack. Yeah, Robert Lane, are you still here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. I just want to know how this concept helps students who want to prepare for careers in medicine and healthcare take required standardized and licensure exams, which still exist, such as the MCAT in step 1, step 2, and step 3. If they're not used to taking standardized tests, and then they get to the college level and higher ed, and then they don't do well because they haven't been exposed.
You'll have to send me the research citations for students not doing well on something like the GRE or the MCAT because of insufficient testing in grades 3 through 8, as well as grade 10 on standardized tests that are completely unrelated in terms of content. And I will happily read those studies and form an opinion based on that afterwards. But I have yet to see any evidence that taking state standardized tests in any way prepares young people for taking other kinds of standardized tests later in life. Students take all kinds of tests in schools. And in fact, as I alluded to earlier, I'm not entirely opposed to the idea of zero stakes, NAEP style standardized tests that, if in fact those did prepare students, and again, I actually am not convinced that they would be in any way predictive of performance on other kinds of standardized tests later in life, then if that in fact were the case, that would solve the problem.
Okay.
Thanks, Jack.
What about school districts who don't teach test-taking skills?
I think I think that if they don't teach test-taking skills and they are instead teaching things that are actually relevant to the curriculum, that's a good thing. And that if we want to teach students test-taking skills for the purpose of passing other tests later in life, then that's a different problem to solve. And there's an entire testing industry that has given us 3/4 of a century of evidence that there are particular tips and tricks that you can learn in order to score better on the tests that are offered by organizations like the College Board, ETS.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Gordon Davis, you had a couple of questions.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, Gordon.
The questions are these alternate options compliant with federal law? And I had a second question, and it is this: the high school graduation requirements seem to be unfair. It has inequities about it. That is, you pay taxes to get a diploma, they go there 12 years, and all of a sudden they say, no, you can't get it. That seems to be inequitable. And then there's the unfairness is that private schools and other schools don't have to take the MCAS test, and that would seem to be unfair as well. So those are the two questions.
I got so focused listening to the second point that I forgot the first question. So let me start with the second one, and then Noe's going to have to remind me of the first one. You're right that there are real inequities there, and that is why most states have phased out their graduation exams. Again, ours is more of a de facto exit exam, but states like California phased out their exit exams because they looked at the data and they found that they were systematically denying the basic entry-level credential more often to BIPOC students, low-income students, students from immigrant backgrounds, right? The very kinds of students who we as a society should be concerned about creating more opportunities for. And so, you made a number of points there that I would just echo. To come back to the first question, it was about performance assessments. I remember that much.
Are performance assessments in compliance? Oh, go ahead.
Right. Got it. Federal law. It all depends on how you use them. So certainly there are ways to use performance assessments that would be in compliance with federal law. So the way that you would go about doing this, and there have been efforts through federal waivers. There was one in New Hampshire, for instance, to design a performance assessment system that is truly used as a system, and to then test that and see, does this give you the same kind of information that you were getting from your state standardized tests? Now, the problem with that is that if you believe that state standardized tests are a not entirely equitable form of assessment, then you're handcuffed there, because what you have to show is comparability between your alternative assessment and the existing state standardized test. So yes, they can be, but then what I would advocate for is we need a little bit more flexibility in federal law there, so that we aren't essentially just producing the results of standardized tests by using performance assessments, which I will note would still be better than using standardized tests, because at least students are engaging in actual meaningful work inside the classroom rather than sitting for an externally developed standardized test that happens outside the context of where they're really learning.
But it's still to a great degree sort of undermining one of the core purposes of the alternative assessments, which is to better assess students,
100%.
not just to assess them in the same incompetent manner we're doing now.
Yep, you got it, Noe.
Let's see here. Actually, I'm gonna go back to Mara, who had another question that people are seconding and thirding. So do you want to ask that question? By the way, before you do that, there's some really good comments being made in the chat in the chat. So if folks sort of aren't keeping an eye on that, I think there's some really interesting comments there.
Thanks. I think my comment or my question was more maybe a little off the topic of MCAS, but I think when we start to look at assessment and look at standardized tests, and we are, I'm an educator in formerly Wachusett, now in the Worcester schools, and very frustrated by the idea that our students are expected to learn things that aren't necessarily developmentally appropriate. And then we're testing them on, finding them not to be proficient, and labeling them or siphoning them off into areas where they are, labeled throughout their educational experience as deficient somehow. And I also speak to this as a parent who has watched my kid be traumatized by the school district that he graduated from. Thank goodness I say this glibly, thank goodness for COVID that he didn't have to take MCAS as a graduation requirement because of his graduating class, because I don't know that he would have passed it. And he's at college now, but I watched what the public schools did to him, and what I can only imagine is being done to other kids, and wondering why we can't make changes to this.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I mean, I'll just jump in and say that I've got a 7th grader who this year's a little better, but who has just liked school less since 3rd grade. That she literally came home in 3rd grade and asked, why do we spend so much time taking practice tests, right? And we're not a district that is notorious for test prep, right? This is a kid who comes home and says, like, here's the half of my lunch I didn't eat because they don't give us enough time to eat lunch. We're not notorious for this, right? We're not the Chicago Public Schools, which didn't have recess for about a decade because they wanted to channel that time into preparing students for their state standardized tests. And so thinking about what is the purpose of education? What is good for young people? What would young people choose for themselves, right? If they could move deeper into their lives and then look back on their experiences in school and say, okay, here's what I needed more of. Here's what I needed less of, right? That kind of thinking, I think, is really absent in our policy conversations. And one of the things that I sometimes get challenged on is the idea that young people should actually enjoy being in school. And I will continue making that point despite the fact that some people just adamantly disagree with me, because young people are human beings, and they ought to be treated like human beings. And that there are all kinds of things that we should want to happen in our schools that don't ultimately lead to things like career earnings. Like, I want my kid to go to a racially and economically integrated school just because it's a good thing, right? I don't think that it's going to advantage her in terms of a future career. I don't think that it's going to lead to her having a better shot at getting into a prestigious college. I think it's going to make her a better person. I think it's going to lead to us living in a better society. And I think that we all can probably think of lots of things that we should want to happen in our schools just because they're right, and because they're good for young people, and because young people would want them for themselves if, again, they were able to sort of move forward in their lives and with hindsight look back on the things that ultimately were really valuable for them.
Well
And
said.
heck, we ought to listen to them now too.
Yes.
1000%.
Yes. Finding ways of doing that would be valuable. And that's, I think, one of the powers of your survey, is getting more student voice into the conversation. So we're out of time for the questions. There are other really good questions in here, and I think we'll try to share them with Jack afterwards, and maybe get some responses to send out to folks afterwards. But really great questions, folks. Thank you for your contributions. Oh, I am told I can take more time by the person who controls this. Thank you, Emily. How much more time do I have?
Oh, well, I'm just noting that we do have until 5:30 for the event, Noe. So I think we could do,
Cool.
up
Okay.
to 10 more minutes of questions, and then Jen will just close us up around then.
All right. I started to close this down too soon. Thank you. Thank you for correcting me. Well,
No, hey, Noe, before you pick another question, this
Yes.
is like, I'm like showing behind the curtain here. My daughter is supposed to be on her violin lesson right now, and I do not hear violin being played downstairs. Give me 7 seconds to just yell downstairs.
That's quite all right. Understand that. I had to do the
Hey,
same
are
thing.
you on your lesson? Well, thank you for bearing with that technical challenge.
Parenting successfully accomplished. So let me ask Teresa Lynn from the United Way to ask her a question.
Thank you so much. I'm going to word it differently because I wasn't really, I listened to what you've been saying and I've been thinking about it, but it's in your group's model. I think there was a slide before how you assess kids and how you're going to assess what the classroom educators and kids need around supports. Do you remember this? So say they're either special education kids or kids, so the different markers. How are you?
Okay, you may be referring to something that we're doing in Lowell right now about aligning district supports with the particular needs of schools.
Okay, so is that part of the model that you're envisioning?
Yeah, I mean, we should ultimately go beyond just saying, here are the results, right? Here's the data, to be thinking about how do we build systems of improvement, right?
Right, but I think my point is, in the way I think about this is that could be done right now, and it's not, because that sits with a central office function. It's not a tool, it just doesn't happen.
Well, yeah, I mean, sure, yes, that ultimately lots of tools are things that could just happen if people had more time and we're all on the same page, right? That tools are, often heuristics that just sort of give us an easy way of making decisions and decrease the cognitive load of particular kinds of things that we want to do on a regular basis. So, I think you could say, this can happen right now without a tool. I think it's more likely to happen if we offer some form of support there, a heuristic of sorts. But you're right. I mean, just as we don't need to have, you know, this multi-dimensional school quality framework, we could say, like, come on, folks, we know what a good school is. Let's all open our eyes, right? And let's start listening to each other. Let's take educators seriously. Let's take young people seriously. We know it's about more than MCAS scores, graduation rates, you know, attendance rates. But I think that if we can offer tools that encourage particular kinds of thought and particular kinds of processes, that increases the likelihood that we'll do those things that we want to do.
I think it also depends on the kind of data you're using to guide that. As you said before, Jack, having a wall of MCAS scores doesn't provide the same kind of guidance in terms of what's happening in the schools. So I think that goes into it as well. Thank you, Teresa, for bringing that up. Judy Pacino, you had a question. Judy, you still here?
I am sorry, I
great.
was muted. I couldn't get myself unmuted. I
Quite
have
all right.
a couple of questions. And so could you point to whichever, tell me which one?
You can ask. You can
Your
ask
best, whatever
either
you
or
think is your
both.
best question.
Yes, either or both.
Okay, I honestly don't remember the second one, so I'll tell you the first one. This is a naive question because I just don't know why. I would like to know why the MCAS are so high stakes. Is it a matter of funding? Is there federal funding involved, state funding? What makes it such a big deal?
Sure. Yeah. Well, this is a huge question if we really want to unpack every element of it. So federal law requires every state to have a standardized test that measures student achievement in grades 3 through 8 as well as 1 year of high school. The original iteration of federal law, the original iteration was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, but as it was reauthorized and signed into law in 2002 by George W. Bush as NCLB, it then required a particular kind of stakes for schools. And so for roughly 13 years, schools would literally be shut down by federal law if they did not move students to proficiency within a certain number of years. Now, when NCLB was reauthorized as ESSA in 2015, the Every Student Succeeds Act, those AYP requirements, adequate yearly progress, were peeled back. And so the stakes have come down a bit, but still every state does have a set of either carrots or sticks. Most have sticks, and those sticks come in the form often of shaming schools, right? Giving them ratings that can lead to superintendents losing their jobs, principals losing their jobs. The lowest performers are often taken over. So we've seen this in Massachusetts with districts losing autonomy, right? Losing control over their schools, elected school committees being stripped of their powers, right? So a de-democratization of public education. And so it really does vary from state to state. But for me, the most problematic aspect is, and I've referred to this a number of times in terms of talking about a theory of change, right? Is this idea that threats and punishment will lead to school improvement, because ultimately what it displays is a radical misunderstanding of educators and school and district leaders in terms of what motivates them to do their work, right? They're not just collecting paychecks. In fact, relative to their education levels, they are grossly underpaid. You can look up the statistics on the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They receive a lot of their compensation in the form of what sociologist Dan Lordy called psychic rewards, meaning the sense of a job well done, of making a difference in the world, and of doing good work. And if you understand that about educators, then what you'll understand is that I used the line earlier, they're not hiding their best lesson plans in their desks, right? That they're working at full capacity already. And so threats are not going to lead to people trying harder. They're already trying their hardest. So what we then need to be thinking through is, all right, if having any kind of stakes there, whether it be for the educators or the school or the district, if that is not going to lead to improvement, then what is? And ultimately, I think what research suggests is capacity building, right? Is assistance and support.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Jack. Let me invite Ruth Rodriguez-Fay. She wants to share a comment, and then we can turn to Jen to share her comments and thoughts. Ruth, are you still here?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Jack, for this wonderful presentation. I just wanted to discuss, and perhaps you and I can get together, because someone that has been fighting for this, what I call, the racist eugenic test that is used by corporate America to take over the district. And as we see in Massachusetts, and you can also Google the US Census Bureau that found that Massachusetts is the worst state for Latinos to live in. We have the highest Latino youth school dropout, and I call it push out. I served on a Harvard to school prison pipeline, and a Suffolk County judge testified that since the MCAS became a high school requirement, he witnessed a jump in his court over 200% majority Black and Latino, and over 95% of them had failed the test. We know what the test was made for. It's to turn over to the corporate America. The charter school complex, they're against unions, and they take, Teach for America, teachers that don't have a degree in teaching. This is all about corporate America. And if you remember ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, they're the lobbyists that make all the laws to help, increase the wealth of corporate America. And they're the ones behind the Common Core, the testing, the charter. They're the ones who are profiting, taking money away from the neediest school and then calling it, failing. In fact, when Governor Baker spent a whole year telling his constituent, your school are failing, I wrote a letter to him and I said, Governor, if I were you, I'd be embarrassed to tell my constituent that their school are failing, because it's your job to make sure that all schools are succeeding, not just, and so for me, this is really very important, because my community is the one most affected by this. If you look at the only district on the state receivership are all majority Latino student population, Lawrence, Holyoke, and Southbridge. And they've been trying to take Worcester. And now they have a charter school that they're bringing to Worcester. That's how they do it. And we need to fight the educator. And finally, I just want to say this. My first year teaching, our union had a training. Anyone who works with children has to report any sign of abuse or neglect. It's time for educators in Massachusetts to come together and file a 51A against the state, because we have plenty of evidence that this test has been causing harm to our children. Thank you.
Ruth, thank you for that passionate closing statement for us. I don't know if you want to have any response, Jack, or want to let Jen.
I always enjoy Ruth. It's nice to see you again, Ruth.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jack. This has been extraordinary, rich conversation. Thank you to everyone for your comments in the chat. This will be recorded, and we will post the recording so that you can access it. This series has been an important series and raised important issues that we won't resolve. The conversation will need to continue. So thank you all for joining us in this, and thank you to Noe, and thank you to Jack. Onward, as they say. And good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you,
Emily,
everyone, for
anything
coming.
for closing? Okay,
Thanks for
great.
inviting
Thank
me.
you all.
Bye,
Okay.
everybody.
Bye.